If you guys have a Bible, if you guys can turn to 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. And it says, "But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light." Amen. This is one of my favorite verses, and it's an amazing verse because Peter gives 4 titles to the church that really explains its identity, right? And what I'm hoping through the sermon, what I want to accomplish is to really redefine for you what you think the church is. I'm hoping that the posture of your heart, your attitude, and your actions toward the church will find its basis on these truths and not our own. Because a lot of us, and many of you, have your own idea of what church should be, right? How it should function, the way it should look like. But I think we need to get rid of those ideas and really seek to be biblical in our definition. And I think Peter helps us out with that. He defines the church by using 4 phrases. And I love the phrases he uses to describe us. He says, the church is a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession. And for this sermon, I'm just going to focus on the first 2. And next time I speak, I'll do the other 2, okay? So let's begin with the church as a chosen race. What does it mean that the church is a chosen race? This phrase was actually used in the Old Testament to describe the Israelites. It was used to refer to the Jews who were unified and connected by having the same bloodline and ethnic heritage, right? The nation of Israel, physical Israel, was a chosen race. But Peter does something that almost doesn't make sense. What was once used to describe a specific race, he writes to a community of people and applies that phrase to a group that's diverse in racial and cultural background. He applies it to a group of people who don't possess a singular bloodline. Now, how can this be? How can you describe the church as a chosen race when it's clearly multicultural and diverse in its bloodline, right? We're not all Jewish, we're not all Korean, we're not all Filipino, right? We're all diverse, but how can he describe us as a chosen race? One thing we have to understand is that this was actually prophesied in the Old Testament, where one day God would gather people together to become one race for his purposes. The book of Isaiah and the other prophets describe a moment in history where the peoples of the world, not just the Jews, will gather together to become one race. But these people won't be connected by a single bloodline. But if not by their blood, then what? How can they be one race? What will make them one race? Because, right, it's our Filipino blood or our Korean blood or our white blood that makes us a single people, a race. How can the church that almost makes up every race in the world be described as one in such a foundational way? You see, it would be blood that connects us, just not our own, but by the blood of the Messiah that saves us. In other words, it will be the blood on the cross that creates a new humanity, a new race. And do you see what this is saying? If you really understand this, do you see what this is saying? This is saying that the work of the cross will be so deep and it will bring such profound transformation into your life that the blood of Christ will be thicker and more fundamental to your identity than the blood of your race. It means that before you're a Korean, before you're a Filipino, before you're white, before you're this or that, you are a Christian. This is your new identity. This is your new fundamental identity. Now, this has a lot of implication and issues that we can address if we really think about it. But I just want to point out one thing. If what connects us is the blood of Christ, if that's a central thing that brings us together as a people, the amazing thing about this race is that your membership won't be based on your background or culture. It won't be based on the color of your skin. It means you can't get into it through your heritage. And let me take it even beyond that. You can't get into it based on your socioeconomic background, on your educational background, or your family history. Your membership won't be earned through your abilities, through your skills, and through how good you are. The only way to be a part of this newly formed people is to be chosen by God through the blood of Christ. And that's why Peter doesn't just say a race, but a chosen race. And this is so key to understanding what the church is supposed to be. Let me just explain this concept of chosen. This concept of being chosen is extremely important. But it's been really taken out of context many times. And let me really define for you what this word really means, okay? Because if we don't, it can lead to a lot of dangerous implications, and it can be used in a way that can be devastating to other people. A friend of mine who's not a believer, he's the friend that I always talk about in my sermons, who's like a mystic, he believes in all these gods or whatever. One of the things that he hates about Christianity, and especially about Judaism, is the concept of chosen race. Because he believes that when a people group define themselves as chosen, it can lead to serious outcomes, because it leads to creating a huge amount of pride and elitism. And one of the examples that he always gives me is the Nazis and their campaign as an example. Hitler and his Nazi party believed that their race was a superior race, that they were the chosen ones. And this implied that everybody else, every other people group, were inferior and even subhuman. And as we all know, this type of thinking led to millions of Jews being killed for being the inferior race, right? And my friend's absolutely right. Chosen race defined in these terms would lead to a group that's extremely prideful and arrogant. But do you see how he's defining the word chosen here? He's using it synonymous with the word choice, that they believe to be a choice people, the top of the line, the greatest value and worth. Like when we say that steak is USDA choice, right? What do we mean by that? We mean that's the top of the line, right? It's the best quality. There's nothing better than that. In other words, it would be what we would choose as our first pick because of its inherent value. That's how he's using the word choice, and that's how he sees the word choice in the Bible, chosen in the Bible. But when you really read the Bible, my friend has got it completely wrong when he applies that definition to this passage. When Peter describes the church as a chosen race, he's not using the word chosen defined as choice, as in a choice people, but rather quite the opposite. If you guys have your Bible, can you guys turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7, 6 through 8? This is a great way to understand how Peter uses the phrase. We have to see how it was applied to the Israelites. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. God says this of Israel. He says, "For you are a people holy to the Lord your God, his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth." And you have to really catch this part. "It was not because you were more numerous than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you are the fewest of all peoples, but it is because the Lord loves you." Now, do you see how God is using the word chosen here? He's saying to Israel, I didn't choose you because you were the greatest or because you were the most numerous, but because in fact you were the least and the smallest. I chose you simply because I love you. Do you see what God is saying here? He's saying me choosing you wasn't because you were great or because you earned it. You're actually not good enough, but you're in because I chose to love you. You see, when he says to Israel and his church that we are a chosen race, he's not commending us. He's actually speaking volumes about his own love. And when you understand the word chosen in these terms, you can conclude that what it really means to be a part of God's people is to accept God's unmerited love. A Christian is someone who knows that on the basis of the unmerited love of God, on the merits of Jesus' blood and not our own, that we've been brought into this new race. And that's why my friend is completely wrong. You see, the church as a chosen race, it's not elitism. It's actually the opposite. It's a group of people who are confessing that they're not elite, that they could never be good enough before God. That we have only been brought in through the blood of Christ, and we've been chosen through that. And that's the fundamental truth of God's people. And that is how the blood of Christ brings us together to create a new race. And do you see how backwards this is? The way that it's so backwards from the way the world functions. Every club and every society in this world is based on how good you are, whether you meet the requirements or not. But God knew that you never had a chance to get in this club, to get in this group of people. No matter how hard you try, no matter how many religious rituals you did, no matter how successful you were, or what type of background or culture you came from, you would always fall short. But out of God's grace, Jesus shed his blood so that he would make a way for you to be part of God's glorious people. Simply put, the truth of the matter is none of you are part of God's group because you're all that. None of you can ever say, I was brought in to be a Christian because in some way I was better than someone else. It was simply God's choice, His grace over you. You see, the true mark of God's people is a gospel humility. It's this poor spirit that's been humbled and yet so overjoyed that God has chosen them in spite of their numerous sins. A Christian doesn't walk around in pride or with an air of self-righteousness, but he's just so in shock that God would choose him and love him in this way, that God will allow him to be a part of His people. Now, New Life, does this define us? Are we marked by this type of gospel humility? When people come into our church, do they get a sense that we are a people who have been chosen not based on what we did, but we're just so in love with God and so in awe that God has chosen us to be part of His church? I'm hoping that our church will grow in this area, because when we do, I believe this is the first step that we need to take if we're going to reflect and be what God has intended for us to be. So let me sum it up in this way. The church as a chosen race means that it is a community of people humbled by the unmerited love and favor of God shown through the gospel. That is the church, and that is who we're called to be. Now, let me move on to the second phrase. The second phrase he uses is royal priesthood. What does it mean to be a royal priesthood? I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Christian concept of priest, prophet, and king. But it's a survey that a lot of churches use to gauge how you fit into the body of Christ. The three categories basically tell us in what ways you're gifted in terms of how you can serve the church. And we all have a little bit of all of them, but we're probably geared towards one more than the other two. So if you're more of a king, your gifts will be geared toward more administration and mobilizing people, because that's what kings did. And these would be like Daniel and Peter, like the elders and the board members. And if you're more of a prophet, you would be geared towards speaking truth and teaching people. And because in the Old Testament, that's what the prophets did, right? They spoke the truth of God. And these people would be the Bible study teachers, the pastors, and even those teaching on an informal level. And now we get to priests. Now, if this is your primary strength, you're gifted in praying for people, taking care of people, and sacrificing for them. And this makes perfect sense because that's what priests in the Old Testament did. They were the ones who would pray for the people of Israel, taking their needs before God. They performed the sacrifices in the temple and took care of the poor and needy. That was their job description, responsible for the well-being of Israel. And I think this is a perfect way to explain what Peter had in mind when he gave that title of royal priesthood to the church. Because simply put, the church was created to be a people of priests, given the responsibility to love one another through prayer, sacrifice, and taking care of those in need. Let me make sure you get this. Everyone has been given this responsibility, which means that no one in the church is purely a consumer. If we're all called to be priests, everyone is called to take initiative to love this church. And I believe this is what Peter had in mind and what he was implying. When you look at the way he writes out this verse, right? How does he write it out, right? He doesn't say, but you are a chosen race, and some of you, those who are spiritually mature, are a royal priesthood. He doesn't say that, right? But he refers to the whole church. Every one of you, everyone in this room who professes Christ as our Lord and Savior, who's committed to this church, is a priest. You've been given this responsibility to love, to pray, and to sacrifice. But the truth of the matter is that only a very few of you have taken ownership of this role. And the question is, are you one of them? Or are you part of the majority who have it? It's the way you think about the church, the way you're involved, like that of a priest, or are you a consumer? Are you failing to live out your priesthood? Because God has called every single one of you. And here's how you know. The difference between someone who's living out their priesthood and someone who's not is the difference between having the posture of a contributor or the posture of a consumer. You see, the contributor sees himself as an active and involved member of the whole, and he holds himself just as responsible for the well-being of the group as anyone else. And when he sees a problem, he doesn't get critical or he doesn't complain, but he seeks to be part of the solution. In other words, his mentality is to contribute, is to invest, is to seek to get in the game and not just stay in the sideline, which shows that there is a sense of responsibility and initiative to do what it takes to build up the church of God. This is what it means to have a priest mentality. Now, so what does it mean? So what does a consumer look like? When I was growing up, one of the things that I hated most of all was when teachers would assign group projects. I absolutely hated group projects. For one, I think I could do it better and it would take a lot less time. But what was worst about it was there's always that one person who never does their own share of the work, right? Everyone else does their work except this one person. And what made it even worse was that whenever we would get together as a group to discuss, they would be just as critical and opinionated as everyone else. And in your mind, you're thinking, out of everyone in this group, you should be the last one to talk, right? Because you see, the consumer was there just to consume a free A. He wanted a product, but was unwilling to do anything about it. And he became critical and upset when he didn't get things to his liking or was afraid that he wasn't going to get to A. It's a serve me and give me what I need attitude. Do you guys see that? And isn't that what a consumer is? And in the church, we see this spirit so much. Many of us walk into churches with an attitude and a posture that demands a great service, the best childcare, and we want the church to be perfectly clean, and we want small groups to go this way, and we want money to be used like this. And when things don't go our way, we become critical and harsh. We blame the leadership or the people that are supposed to do it, but have no intention of actually contributing. You see, people just want a product and they start becoming critical and blaming the church when they don't see it. You see, we're walking in here with the serve me and give me what I need attitude. Now, I'm not saying wanting a great service or wanting good childcare or wanting a great small group is a bad thing. Of course, we want those things. But are you willing to be part of that growth? Are you willing to be part of the solution? Are you willing to respond like a priest by praying and by sacrificing and by loving for the church? Or will you continue to be a consumer? Because I want to make a bold statement. I believe the majority of us here have that posture. We are consumers who've come to seek a certain product because we need something. But we're not willing to be contributors. And we have to understand that God has called all you guys. Every one of us here has a responsibility to build up the church. Just as you guys are just as responsible as I am, or Pastor Charles, or Stacy, or the board members. We have been all given this responsibility. Now, I was thinking about this. Why are we so critical about church, but unwilling to do anything about it? If you guys can do me a favor and just close your eyes. I just need a little interaction here, okay? Close your eyes and just follow my instructions, all right? Imagine church the way that it was supposed to be, right? The perfect church. Imagine what it would look like, okay? Think about what the service would be like. The sermon, the praise set. Think about the way the building, how the building would look like, how the childcare would be run. I want you to really think about it. Imagine it, okay? Now, what are the small groups like? How about the people in the small groups? Are they nice? Are they thoughtful? How's the money being used? What would a church that's perfect, how would that money be used? Really picture it, okay? Do you guys see it? Okay, now open your eyes. Now, I want you to take that picture that you have in your mind, right? I want you to take it, and I want you to crumple it up and throw it in the trash and never pick it up again. And here's why. You see, for many of you, the reason why you're so critical and yet you don't want to get involved in church is because you love your idea of a perfect church more than the actual church itself. You have this picture of what church should be, and you're so in love with it that when you don't see it, you get resentful and you get critical and you begin to blame. But you don't want to do anything about it because you actually don't love the church and the people in it. You just love your idea. Um, let me give you guys an example of what I mean by this. I have a friend of mine, Angeline, and one thing that she told me was that her parents, right? I've met her parents a couple times, and they have this great marriage, right? It's like awesome. They're always serving one another. They're like loving one another. But one thing that shocked me was that when Angeline told me that the first 10 years of their parents' marriage was actually super rocky. There was a lot of disappointment. There was a lot of anger. There was a critical spirit and all these things. But after the 10th year, things changed. And the marriage began to be one of joy and service with a deep sense of commitment. And I asked her, what changed? What changed? What happened on that 10th year? You see, her mom realized that she loved the idea of a perfect husband more than the husband that was right in front of her. So whenever the husband would fall short of her ideal husband, she would get resentful, she would get bitter and critical. And this made it hard for her to serve and love because she was a consumer. She had a perfect product in mind and she wasn't getting it. She loved her idea more than her husband. But when she realized that, she made a choice. She took that idea, those expectations, and threw it in the trash. And she chose to love her husband, her actual imperfect husband, and not her idea of one. And without the idea of perfection hanging over every interaction that she had with her husband, it was so much easier for her to not be critical and to love and to grow in her love for her husband. Here's another example. When you first get into ministry, one of the things is you get really idealistic, right? And when I started the college group, I had these amazing ideas, right? I was thinking like after I love on them, after I teach them, they're going to be so holy and they're going to be so loving and giving. But honestly, I remember the first 2 years, all I remember is being frustrated, right? I was just always complaining. Why are these guys always late? And the guys, they just kept fighting with one another. They kept just arguing. They were so unholy, on and on and on. But this past year, God has been just rebuking me. And I realized that I actually love the idea of a perfect college group more than the college group itself. And that's why I spent most of my time criticizing them and being resentful that I wasn't getting what I want. And though I still struggle with it, the more I throw away this perfect picture, the more I throw away this perfect picture of Jamel or Jeff or Aaron or Ian, the more I get to love them, right? Because I'm not always disappointed. It's easier to serve, right? And this is what it means to be a priest. It's to love and serve those that God has brought into your lives, no matter how imperfect and frustrating our community may be. It's to respond to the shortcomings of this church, not with a critical heart, and not as consumers who demand things, but rather respond like priests and pray and bring the needs of our church, of our people, before God because we love them. To be a priest doesn't mean that we seek a specific product or a perfect idea that we desire, but rather to seek to offer sacrifices of good deeds before God to build up our church. You see, when God calls us His royal priesthood, He's calling you to this type of posture and heart. And so I pray that you will let go of what you want and your ideas of church, that you will kill your complaining and critical spirit and make room in your heart and your mind for the people right in front of you. That you will stop wanting that you will stop being so disappointed that people aren't what you want them to be, that church isn't what you want it to be like. And then you will love the people that God has brought into your life. And I promise you, when we take seriously our priesthood, when we begin to love in those terms, it will create a life-giving, a truly vibrant community. And you're going to receive so much more than you could have ever thought possible. Do you guys understand what I'm saying? Us as pastors, especially us, we struggle with that because we want to see certain things. We want things to happen. And I found myself these past few years just being so critical. And even at times I would hang out with Stacy and we would have to catch ourselves just complaining about church and saying, why isn't he like this or why isn't he like that? Instead of praying, instead of seeking how I can be part of the solution, how I can lift up my brother and sister so that they can look more like Jesus. That is the posture that I want to have. And He's calling you to that type of, and I hope that we can be that type of church. Okay? Now, for many of you, I mean, you agree with me that we all need to stop being so selfish and love the church by living out our priesthood. But how do we get there? How can I get to a place where we can love without expectations, where we can love without our perfect ideas? Well, you see, in the Old Testament, one of the great privileges that the priests enjoyed was that they had access to God. The presence of God rested in the temple, and the priests were the only ones who were given access. And more specifically, it was the high priest who had the honor of going into the Holy of Holies once a year to be directly into God's presence. That was the honor given to the priests. Now, when Peter says, you're a royal priesthood, that you guys are all priests, do you realize what he's saying in light of this? It means that we've all been given access to God. You see, one of the greatest truths and realities of the gospel is that though you were once cut off from God through the resurrection and death of Christ, you were brought back into God's presence. Access that was once denied has been granted back to you. In other words, you were given God Himself. Through the gospel, you have received access to the greatest treasure in the universe. Now, what does this have to do with not being a consumer, but someone who can love without expectations? Tim Keller, in his book, The Freedom of Self-Forgetfulness, gives an interesting illustration that makes a great point and will help us understand what I'm trying to say. He basically says this, okay? This is like a really weird question in the beginning, but hopefully it makes sense after, okay? When you're walking, do you ever think about your toes? Right? Think about it. How it's doing, how it's feeling. Do you think about your arms? When you wake up, is the first thing you think about your feet or any other part of your body? The answer is you don't, right? But when do you think about it? You only think about a body part when it's in pain, when it's hurting and aching, right? That's the only time you think about it. And he says in the same way, people can't help but to think about themselves all the time because they're hurting, because their hearts are empty. There is this profound emptiness. And so you can't help but be selfish. You can't help but be a consumer. You're looking for that perfect church or product to satisfy you and to fill you. I mean, think about it. You see, your consumer attitude is a sign of your emptiness. A consumer is born when there is a hunger that needs to be met, right? When you're hungry, you become a consumer of food. When you're starving for relationships, you go in search of new people. And when you're deprived of happiness, you go and consume everything that you can to make you happy. And so when your posture in this church is constantly one of a consumer, it gives you away that you're hungry and empty. And just like people who are starving don't have the capacity to look up to share their food with others, your emptiness has made it difficult for you to love and to think about others, and it's made you constantly selfish and a consumer. And here's the truth. The only way to escape this emptiness and stop being selfish is to profoundly understand your priesthood. Is to understand your priesthood. The greatest benefit of what it means to be a priest, and that is your access to God. Because in your access to God, as a priest, you've been given access to the only thing in this world that can actually satisfy you. You see, when you see the benefits of being a priest, you see that you have access to the only thing in this world that can truly satisfy and free you to love. So many of you have such a difficult time loving people and serving them because you can't help but think about yourself. And it's because you have not taken your priesthood seriously. It's because the only remedy for your selfishness and critical spirit is to find full satisfaction in your God. And God has given you access to Him. So go and be loved by Him, and it will give you such great power to love. I shared this last time. I think for the longest time in my own Christian life, I had a very difficult time loving people. I was always selfish. I came because I wanted something else other than God. And it wasn't only until that I really felt filled by God's love and who He is that I began to have the capacity to look at anyone else and really serve them. And even in my relationship with my girlfriend, the only reason I can serve her now is because I found healing. I found God to be so full and so filling that I can have the power and I have the room in my heart to really love her. And the only way that you guys are going to be able to serve in the way that God has called you is to really take advantage of your priesthood and go before God and grow in your intimacy with Him. That is the only way you're going to be able to live that out. So I want to really encourage you guys to take advantage of the benefits of being a priest before God. Okay? Now, to conclude really quickly, the last implication of being a royal priesthood is this. When Peter is referring to the church as a royal priesthood, he's actually drawing from Exodus 19:6, where God calls Israel by this title. And what that meant was this, that the nation of Israel had a vocation, a job to do when God chose them. Remember in the Old Testament, one of the privileges, like we just talked about, is that they had access to God. But it wasn't just so that they could enjoy that privilege for themselves, but they were to be blessed in order to give that blessing to the nations around them. They were called to mediate God's presence to the people and to the nation that surrounded them. And what this meant for Israel was that they were to use that access to mirror God's glory and splendor to the nations around them. They were to be blessed in order to bless them. But as we all know, the Israelites failed and instead did exactly the opposite. But this does give us insight into what it means for the church to be a royal priesthood. You see, the blessing that God has given to our church is the gospel. And He's called you and I to be missional and to mediate that gospel, that blessing to the nations around us, to the people around us. And this is going to happen through proclamation, by announcing the good news. But the more that I think about it, when we live out our priesthood the way that I described it, by loving one another, by sacrificing for one another, that's when the gospel is going to be proclaimed and people won't be able to deny the power and reality of the gospel message. Remember in John, Jesus prays that it's going to be by the way that we love one another that people are going to really know and understand that Jesus is who He says He is. And so once we take our priesthood seriously, when we proclaim the gospel through our priesthood, the world won't be able to deny the power of the gospel. And they will really understand that Jesus is who He says He is. I just want to conclude. You see, the church is not something you go to. It's not an event or even an activity, but it's your identity. The church is not a building. You are the church of Jesus Christ. You are the living stones that God is using to build this church. And He's given you this great privilege, this great opportunity to be His people, to be part of His story, and to really experience His grace by living out His grand purposes. And so when I pray that each and every day when you guys wake up, you guys remember that you guys are the church. That church is not just on Sundays, but it's every day of your life. That He's given you this great purpose to live out. And He's chosen you, and He's made a decision to shower His grace on you so that He can call you to be a part of His people, this new humanity, this royal priesthood.